The wind was a blade, and it had flayed the last of Amelia's strength. Each gust stole the breath from her lungs and left an agony of ice in its place. She shielded the small body pressed against her, a futile gesture in a world that had become a formless, roaring whiteness. Leo was no longer shivering. The terrifying stillness had set in, his small face, peeking from the threadbare blanket, a fragile china doll blue that had nothing to do with the cold. He was slipping away, and she, who had promised to be his savior, was failing him. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into a snowdrift, her body a dead weight. Through the blinding curtain of the blizzard, a dark shape wavered in and out of focus, a fence post. It was a line drawn in the snow, the edge of a world she couldn't reach. It was the end. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered, her words devoured by the wind. "I'm so sorry." One last, primal instinct surged through her. It was the promise she had made to him, a promise sealed in the dead of night as they fled a gilded cage of horrors. She would not let him die in silence. Filling her lungs with the razor-sharp air, she tilted her head back and screamed. It was a sound torn from the very root of her, not a plea but a raw, animal declaration against the storm's indifference. "We're here." The effort cost her the last of her consciousness. As she pitched forward, her world dissolving into black, she thought she heard a sound other than the wind, a splintering of wood, a curse against the cold. Before there was nothing at all. The sound was an unwelcome trespass. For 5 years, Adam had cultivated a fortress of silence, its walls built of routine and solitude. The wind was a familiar companion, the crack of a dying tree a known percussion. But this sound, human, desperate, was a violation. His first instinct, honed by years of deliberate isolation, was to ignore it. To add another log to the fire, turn his back, and let the storm have what it claimed. But as he stood frozen in the center of his Spartan cabin, the sound echoed in the hollowed-out chambers of his memory. It stirred the ghost of a duty he thought long dead. With a low growl of self-loathing, he pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed a lantern, and stepped into the blizzard's fury. He found them huddled against the boundary post, half buried in a drift. The boy first, so small Adam almost mistook him for a bundle of rags. He gathered the child's impossibly light form, the small, cold face shockingly still against his shoulder, and carried him back to the cabin. He laid him on the bare wooden table, then plunged back into the storm for the woman. She was heavier, a dead weight of sodden wool and exhaustion. He hadn't held another human being in. How long? 5 years? 6? The unwelcome intimacy of the act was a shock, a jolt to a system long since powered down. Inside, he barred the door against the storm and got to work. He was no stranger to bodies pushed to their limits. With a detached, almost clinical efficiency, he stripped the wet clothes from the boy, wrapped him in dry blankets, and began rubbing his small limbs, forcing warmth and life back into them. The woman he left by the hearth, trusting the fire to do its work. As the boy began to stir, a low moan escaping his blue-tinged lips, Amelia's eyes fluttered open. Her first sensation was of warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that felt both miraculous and terrifying. She was in a room, a single, spare room, scoured clean and bare of any personal touch. A place scrubbed of memory. A man knelt over the table where Leo lay, his back to her. He was gaunt, his shoulders sharp beneath a worn flannel shirt, a beard hiding the lines of his face. "My son," she rasped, struggling to sit up. The man didn't turn. "He's alive. For now. He has a fever." Relief, sharp and dizzying, washed over her. She pushed herself into a sitting position, ignoring the protest of her aching muscles. "Leo," she whispered. As if hearing her, the boy began to murmur, his words a feverish, nonsensical slur. Adam's hand stilled on the boy's chest. He leaned closer, his head cocked, listening. Amelia's blood ran cold. "No more tea?" Leo whimpered, his eyes still closed. "Please, Mama Amelia. Uncle Sterling said it's good for me. Hurts my tummy." The man at the table went rigid. He said nothing, but Amelia felt his stillness as a physical threat. She had to control this, had to establish the story before the boy's delirium betrayed them completely. "A fever took hold on the trail," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We were heading west to find family. Our wagon broke down 2 days back. The man finally turned, and Amelia got her first clear look at him. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, shadowed with a sorrow so profound it seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. They swept over her, missing nothing. "Your hands," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What?" "They're too soft, unscarred." He glanced at her simple, worn dress. "Not the hands of a woman who's been driving a wagon west." Amelia instinctively hid her hands in the folds of the blanket. My husband did most of the heavy work." She left the lie hanging in the air, a half-finished story of widowhood that was common enough on the frontier to be believable. His gaze dropped to the boy, whose finer underclothes were now visible where the rough blanket had slipped. The stitching was too neat, the fabric too fine. The man said nothing, merely filing the observation away. He moved to the hearth, ladled water into a tin cup, and brought it to her. "Drink," he commanded, "then rest. Tomorrow, if the storm has passed, you can be on your way." The dismissal was clear. They were a temporary problem, an inconvenience to be endured and then forgotten. That was all she could ask for. For 2 days, the blizzard raged, trapping the three of them in the suffocating intimacy of the small cabin. Adam moved with a silent, ghost-like efficiency, tending the fire, preparing a thin broth, checking on the boy. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were clipped and practical. Amelia learned to navigate the small space around him, a satellite in a fixed and lonely orbit. On the third morning, the wind died. Sunlight, brilliant and blinding against the new-fallen snow, streamed through the cabin's single window. With the storm's passing, Leo's fever broke. He woke slowly, his eyes fluttering open to a world of unfamiliar log walls and the scent of wood smoke. His gaze settled on the bearded stranger standing by the hearth, and a primal fear, raw and immediate, seized him. "No," he cried, his voice weak but clear. He scrambled away, pressing himself against Amelia. "Please, don't send me back to Uncle Sterling. Don't let him give me the bad tea." The words, clear and terrified, shattered the cabin's fragile peace. Adam turned from the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. The weary compassion in his eyes had been replaced by something hard and cold as forged steel. He fixed his gaze on Amelia, the silence stretching until it was a physical weight. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," he said, his voice a low growl that promised no quarter. "Starting with who the hell is Sterling?" Amelia's mind raced, a torrent of panic and calculation. One wrong word and they would be cast back into the snow. The man's wintry eyes demanded a truth she couldn't give, but the one she'd prepared felt flimsy against his cold scrutiny. Leo, sensing her fear, whimpered and burrowed deeper into her side. His small, trembling body was her anchor. For him, she would find the words. "Sterling is my late husband's brother," she began, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "When Robert died, Sterling became Leo's legal guardian. The inheritance, it was meant for Leo, but Sterling controls it until my son comes of age." She looked up, forcing herself to meet Adam's gaze. "He's a cruel man. The tea, it was his own concoction. He said it was to calm Leo's frail nerves, but it only ever made him weaker, more listless. I saw what he was doing, trying to keep the boy sickly, dependent. Perhaps worse, the lie was a twisted version of the truth, the skeleton of the real story dressed in different clothes. She had taken a terrible risk, but it was the only one she had. Adam's expression didn't soften. He crossed his arms, a granite wall of disbelief. "If he's the boy's legal guardian, then you stole him." "I saved him." The words tore from her, raw and fierce. "I was his governess. I saw what no one else would. When I threatened to go to the authorities, Sterling locked me in my room. I escaped with Leo in the middle of the night. His family is powerful. Their name buys influence. No one would have believed the word of a hired governess against his." She gestured around the Spartan cabin. "Does this look like the choice of a woman with options? I chose survival for him." He was silent for a long time, his gaze moving from her face to the boy who was now peering at him with wide, terrified eyes. The child's fear was not an act. It was a genuine, deep-seated terror that Adam recognized from the haunted faces of young soldiers who had seen too much. That, more than her words, tipped the scale. "The boy can stay until he's fit to travel," Adam said finally, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "You will earn your keep. There's wood to be chopped, water to be hauled, a cabin that needs more tending than I'm willing to give it." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. But know this, I don't believe you. Not all of you. One more lie, one more half-truth, and you're both out. Truce. It wasn't an offer of comfort, but a laying down of terms. A fragile, conditional truce. Amelia nodded, her throat too tight for words. Life on the homestead fell into a new rhythm, dictated by chores and the vast, silent presence of the man who had granted them sanctuary. Amelia worked from before dawn until long after dusk, repaying her debt with the currency of sweat and diligence. She scrubbed the floors, mended Adam's worn clothes, and coaxed hearty meals from his meager supplies. Slowly, the cabin began to change. A jar of winter grasses appeared on the mantelpiece. The scent of baking bread replaced the stale air of solitude. Small changes, but in the sterile world Adam had built, they were as loud as a shouting match. Adam kept his distance, observing her with a detached watchfulness that kept her constantly on edge. Yet, a subtle shift was occurring, one he seemed to fight at every turn. It began with Leo. The boy, recovering his strength, was drawn to Adam's quiet competence. He would follow him to the barn, a small shadow mimicking the man's long strides. For days, Adam ignored him. Then one afternoon, as he was repairing a harness, Leo spoke. My father, my real father, he showed me how to do that, the boy said, his voice small. Adam's hand stilled. He didn't look at the boy, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the leather. Did he now? He said, his voice rough. He said a good knot holds true, even when everything is pulling apart. Adam set the harness down. He picked up a spare piece of rope and, without a word, began to show Leo a complex knot, his large, calloused fingers moving with surprising dexterity. The boy watched, rapt. It was the first lesson, the first crack in the wall of Adam's isolation. A few days later, Adam was sitting on the porch, carving a piece of pine with a small, sharp knife. Leo sat on the steps below, watching. After a long silence, Adam held out a smaller, smoother piece of wood in the knife. Keep your thumb behind the blade, he said gruffly. And always carve away from yourself. From then on, their evenings were often spent in this quiet companionship. The soft scrape of knives on wood was the only sound, a peaceful counterpoint to the wind whispering outside. Adam found himself talking, telling the boy the names of the trees, the habits of the deer that sometimes came to the creek. He wasn't just teaching the boy to carve a wolf. He was carving a space for him in the frozen landscape of his own heart. Amelia watched these moments with a painful mix of joy and guilt. The gentle, patient man who emerged when he was with Leo was a man she found herself wanting to know, a man she was deeply afraid of losing. Her lie was a chasm between them, growing wider with every shared glance, every quiet meal. One evening, while the men were carving on the porch, she decided to mend the heavy wool coat Adam had been wearing when he found them. It was torn at the shoulder, the fabric frayed. As she worked by the firelight, her fingers found a hidden pocket sewn into the lining. It was an odd lump, too stiff for folded paper. Curious, she worked the object out. It was a small, linen handkerchief, yellowed with age but impeccably clean. In the corner, embroidered in faded blue thread, were two initials, L.V. Leo Vance. Her heart stopped. She glanced quickly toward the porch, but Adam and Leo were still absorbed in their task. How had it gotten there? She hadn't brought it with her. She never would have risked it. Then she remembered. The day they fled, Leo had been clutching his favorite storybook. In her haste, she had tucked this handkerchief inside it as a marker. He must have transferred it to Adam's coat pocket himself, a child's secret treasure. She started to push it back, but it was too late. Adam was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable in the flickering light. Getting cold, he said, his eyes on the handkerchief in her hand. Amelia's fingers closed around it. Yes, I was just finishing this. She held up the coat, trying to keep her voice steady. The shoulder was badly torn. He didn't move. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding a question he didn't ask. He knew. He must have seen the initials. But he said nothing. He just took the coat, his fingers brushing hers for a brief, electric moment, and hung it back on its peg. The next day, the unspoken tension was a palpable thing. Adam was more withdrawn than ever, the brief warmth of the preceding days gone, replaced by a chilling silence. He took his rifle and went out hunting at dawn, leaving Amelia and Leo alone in a cabin that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. Amelia spent the day on edge, watching the tree line, her mind a whirlwind of desperate plans. She had to leave. She couldn't stay under the weight of his suspicion, of his silent judgment. He returned as dusk was settling, a pair of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He didn't speak as he cleaned them, his movements precise and economical. Just as Amelia was about to break the silence, to tell him they would leave in the morning, Leo, who was watching from the porch, suddenly pointed toward the horizon. "Someone's coming," the boy said. Amelia's heart leapt into her throat. Adam straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth, his eyes scanning the distant ridge. A lone rider was silhouetted against the blood red of the setting sun. He was too far away to make out features, but he wasn't moving like a casual traveler. He sat on his horse, a still and menacing shape, and lifted something to his eye, a spyglass. It glinted once in the last rays of sunlight as it panned slowly across the small homestead. Amelia felt a cold dread seep into her bones. He had found them. Adam moved to stand beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring wall. He didn't look at her, but she felt a shift in him. He was no longer the brooding recluse or the suspicious host. In that instant, as they stood watching the hunter on the ridge, he became her shield. The rider held his position for several long, agonizing minutes. Then, as if satisfied with his reconnaissance, he lowered the spyglass, turned his horse, and disappeared back over the ridge. He hadn't approached. He hadn't revealed himself. He had simply made his presence known. The outside world, with all its dangers, had found them. And in the face of that shared threat, the secret between them was suddenly, terrifyingly, irrelevant. The silhouette on the ridge lingered in Amelia's mind long after it was gone, a dark imprint against the memory of the sunset. It was a promise, a declaration. The fragile piece of the homestead was a shattered pane of glass, and she could feel the cold wind of the outside world blowing through the cracks. Adam didn't speak of the rider that night. Instead, he worked, cleaning his Winchester rifle with a slow, methodical deliberation that was more unnerving than any spoken threat. The scent of gun oil filled the small cabin, a sharp, metallic tang that overlaid the familiar smell of wood smoke. Amelia put Leo to bed, her hands trembling as she tucked the blankets around him. The boy seemed oblivious to the new tension, his mind full of the small victories of his day, a perfectly carved rabbit, a successful knot. He fell asleep with a contented sigh, a small island of innocence in a sea of adult fear. "He calls himself Elias Vance," Adam said, breaking the silence. He was sighting down the rifle's barrel toward the hearth, though his eyes seemed to be looking at something far more distant. Amelia's head snapped up. "How do you know?" "I took a trip to Redemption today. For supplies." He set the rifle down and began wiping it with a clean cloth. A man was in the saloon, asking questions. Quiet man, cold eyes, asking if anyone had seen a woman and a sick boy passing through a few weeks back. Did they tell him? The words were a choked whisper. Folks in Redemption don't talk much to strangers, especially ones who look like trouble. But a man like that, he doesn't need them to talk. He listens, he watches, he'll find his answers. He looked directly at her then, his winter sky eyes holding no judgment, only a grim assessment of their new reality. "He knows we're here, or he will soon." Amelia wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill seeping deep into her bones. Sterling hadn't just hired a man, he'd hired a predator. "What do we do?" Adam picked up the rifle again, his movements measured and calm. "Tomorrow, you learn how to use this." The lessons began at dawn. He took her to a clearing behind the barn, the early morning air crisp and smelling of pine. The rifle was heavy in her hands, an alien weight of cold steel and unforgiving wood. It felt wrong, a violation of the quiet, nurturing world she had always tried to build. "It's got a kick," Adam said, his voice all business. He stood behind her, his presence a solid wall of warmth against the morning chill. "Plant your feet. Lean into it. Don't fight it. Become part of it." His hands covered hers on the stock, guiding her position. His touch was impersonal, the grip of a teacher, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold. His breath stirred the hair at her temple as he leaned in to show her how to sight down the barrel. "Line up the notch with the post. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. A pull will send the shot wide." It's a slow, steady squeeze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was acutely aware of his closeness, of the scent of leather and gunpowder that clung to him. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle exploded against her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force that sent a jarring impact through her entire body. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left of the tin can he'd set on a fence post. Again, was all he said. Day after day, the ritual was repeated. Her shoulder ached with a deep, purple bruise. But she learned. She learned the weight and balance of the weapon, the disciplined intake and release of breath, the feel of the trigger's breaking point. And in the process, something else was happening. The shared task, the enforced proximity, was weaving a new kind of thread between them. They spoke of sight alignment and windage, but beneath the practical words, a different conversation was taking place. A language of shared vulnerability, of unspoken reliance. One afternoon, as she finally hit the can dead center, sending it spinning into the tall grass, a small, triumphant smile touched her lips. She turned to find him watching her, a strange expression on his face. It wasn't the cold assessment of a teacher or the suspicion of a reluctant host. It was something softer, more complex. You learn fast, he said, his voice a low rumble. I have a good reason to, she replied, the smile fading as she remembered why this grim skill was necessary. The moment stretched, charged with an unspoken current. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, a desire for connection he fought as fiercely as he would fight any physical threat. He took a half step toward her, and her breath caught in her throat. The air crackled with the possibility of a touch, a word, a confession. The sharp crack of a breaking branch from the woods behind them shattered the spell. Adam's head whipped around, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle. He pushed her behind him, his body a shield, his eyes scanning the dense tree line. They waited, hearts pounding, for what seemed like an eternity. Nothing, only the sigh of the wind through the pines. A deer, maybe, he said finally, though the tension didn't leave his shoulders. The moment had passed. The fragile connection was severed, pushed back under the surface by the constant, looming threat. The psychological warfare began a week later. Adam was checking his trap lines by the creek when he found it. A rabbit, caught in one of his snares, had been meticulously skinned and cleaned. Tucked neatly into its chest cavity was a small, almost perfect, robin's egg, its delicate blue a shocking splash of color against the red of the meat. It was a message of profound violation. It said, I was here, I walked your land, touched your property, and you never knew. I can get to you. I can get to what you hunt, what you eat, what you love. Adam didn't tell her about the egg. But that evening, a new, harder edge had returned to his demeanor. He began to patrol the perimeter of the homestead at dusk and again at dawn, the Winchester a permanent extension of his arm. He was a sentinel, a guardian, a man falling back on the only skills he trusted, the deadly arts of the soldier. The fear was a constant, unwelcome guest in the cabin, sitting with them at meals, sleeping in the corners of the rooms. Amelia saw it in the way Adam's eyes constantly scanned the windows, in the way Leo had stopped venturing far from the porch. The joy the boy had found in his small chores was being replaced by a quiet, watchful anxiety. The breaking point came with the moon. It was a hunter's moon, a perfect, silver disk that bathed the prairie in an ethereal, shadowless light. It was a night for predators. Amelia was woken from a shallow sleep by a sound. Not a loud noise, but a subtle one. The soft whinny of a horse from the barn, a sound of distress. She sat up, her heart pounding. Beside the hearth, Adam was already on his feet, pulling on his boots, the rifle in his hand. He motioned for her to stay quiet, putting a finger to his lips. He moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit yard. Amelia crept to his side. The yard was empty, bathed in an unnaturally bright light. Nothing seemed out of place. He's in the barn, Adam whispered, his voice barely audible. Trying to draw me out. He moved silently to the cabin door, checking the bar he had reinforced just days before. He was right. It was a trap, a classic military tactic. Create a disturbance, lure your enemy into the open killing field. They waited in the suffocating silence, the only sound the frantic thumping of Amelia's own heart. Minutes stretched into an hour. The horse had fallen silent. The world outside was still. Then, a new sound. The gentle, almost melodic creak of the porch swing Adam had built for Leo. Amelia's blood ran cold. He wasn't in the barn anymore. He was on their porch. He was playing with them, rocking gently back and forth in the boy's swing, a phantom guest in the moonlight. Adam's face was a mask of cold fury. He moved to the door, his hand on the bar, clearly intending to confront the man, to end this torment. "No," Amelia mouthed, grabbing his arm. "It's what he wants." He looked down at her, his eyes blazing. She shook her head, her plea urgent and silent. He hesitated, his body coiled like a spring, a battle raging within him between the soldier's instinct to attack and the protector's need to stay with those he was guarding. The creaking stopped. A profound silence descended once more. Had he gone? Then a shape appeared at the window, a face, pale in the moonlight, peering in. It was Vance. His eyes were empty, devoid of emotion. He looked directly at Amelia, and then his gaze shifted to the small alcove where Leo slept. He held their stare for a heart-stopping second, then raised a hand and tapped once, gently, on the glass. A friendly little rap, a neighborly hello. Then he was gone. Amelia sank to the floor, a strangled sob escaping her lips. The terror was absolute. He hadn't just been on their porch. He had looked into their home, had seen her, had seen the sleeping child. Adam knelt beside her, pulling her into a rough, desperate embrace. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with a rage he could barely contain. "I'm here." He didn't get in, but he had gotten in. He'd breached their walls, invaded their sanctuary, and touched them with the cold finger of fear. The invisible line between the threat outside and the safety within had been erased. As Adam held her, his resolve hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp point. This couldn't continue. The waiting, the watching, the psychological torment. It was destroying them. It was time to stop being the hunted and become the hunter. The next morning, he found it. Tucked beneath the antler of a freshly killed deer, laid carefully on their doorstep, was a single, perfect peacock feather. The iridescence of it shimmered in the morning sun, a thing of impossible, decadent beauty in their harsh, practical world. It was a calling card, a signature. It was a declaration of war. Adam's silence was a more terrifying thing than any storm. He walked into the cabin, the dead deer slung over his shoulder, and laid it on the floor with a heavy, final thud. He said nothing of the cold, nothing of the hunt. He simply reached into his coat and produced the peacock feather. He placed it in the center of the rough-hewn table, a jewel of impossible color in their gray, Spartan world. It lay there, shimmering and obscene, an indictment and a question. Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. She looked from the feather to Adam, whose expression was utterly devoid of emotion. He had shuttered himself away, and behind those cold, winter sky eyes, a terrible judgment was being rendered. "He was on our doorstep this morning," Adam said, his voice flat, as if speaking of the weather. "Left this for us, a gift." Leo, drawn by the feather's beauty, reached a small hand toward it. Adam's voice stopped him, not with volume but with a deadly quiet. "Don't touch it." The boy froze, hand hovering, then retreated to Amelia's side, sensing the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The fragile truce had been annihilated. "I want the truth," Adam said, his gaze pinning Amelia in place. "All of it. Now." The time for half measures was over. The lie she had so carefully constructed had become a cage, and now its walls were closing in. Her voice, when it came, was a trembling whisper, but it held the unvarnished ring of truth, stripped bare by terror. "His name is Leo Vance," she began, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Sterling is his stepfather. Leo's father, a wealthy merchant, died of a sudden fever last year, leaving his entire estate to his only son." She walked to the small chest where she kept their few belongings and retrieved a small, cork-stoppered vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. She placed it on the table beside the feather. "This is what Sterling called his special tonic," she said, her voice shaking. "For Leo's delicate constitution. He administered it himself every night. He's a patient man. You see, he wanted it to look natural. A slow, sad decline. The family doctors were on his payroll. They saw only what he told them to see. A grieving stepfather doing his best for a sickly child." She recounted it all, the listlessness after each dose, the clammy sweat, the stomach pains Leo was too young to properly describe. She told him of her dawning horror, of confronting Sterling, of the cold, reptilian smile he'd given her as he explained that a governess's hysterical accusations would mean nothing against the word of a man of his standing. He said he would have me committed to an asylum. She finished, tears she couldn't stop now streaming down her face. He would be the hero, saving his poor, sick stepson from a madwoman. I had no choice. I took Leo, I took the tonic as proof, and I ran. Adam listened without moving, his face carved from stone. When she was finished, the silence that followed was absolute. He looked at her, and she saw nothing in his eyes. No pity, no anger, no understanding. Just a vast, empty distance. He had been betrayed, he had offered his sanctuary, and she had brought this world of lies and poison into it. Without a word, he turned, took his axe from its place by the door, and walked out of the cabin, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. Amelia sank into a chair, a sob catching in her throat. She had known this was a risk, but the reality of his rejection was a physical blow. She had lost. After all this, after everything they had endured, she had lost their only protector. She spent the next hour in a state of numb despair. Outside, she could hear the rhythmic, violent thwack of the axe as Adam split firewood with a relentless, punishing fury. It was the sound of him severing their connection, chopping away the fragile bonds that had formed between them. She knew they couldn't stay. To remain would be to trespass on his grace, a grace that had now been rescinded. With heavy, leaden movements, she began to pack their few belongings into a small bundle. Leo watched her, his lower lip trembling. "Is he sending us away?" the boy whispered. "We have to go, my love," she said, her voice breaking. "We can't stay where we're not wanted." Adam's fury was a white-hot fire, burning away the thaw that had begun in his soul. A lie. It had all been built on a lie. He had let them in, let the boy chip away at his solitude, let the woman's quiet presence fill the empty spaces in his home. And for what? To be made a fool of, to be used as a hiding place in a sordid drama of wealth and murder. The pain of it was sharp and familiar. It was the old wound, the one he had come to these mountains to forget, torn open again. Betrayal. He brought the axe down again and again, the physical exertion a welcome outlet for the storm raging inside him. He didn't stop until a small voice cut through his rage. "Please, protect us." He froze, the axe held mid-swing. Leo stood a few feet away, his small face pale, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. The boy had found him in the barn, where he had retreated after exhausting his need to split wood. "Please don't be mad at Mama, Amelia," Leo said, taking a hesitant step closer. "She was saving me from the bad tea. He hurt her, too, when she tried to stop him." The boy's words cut through the haze of Adam's anger. He wasn't pleading for himself. He was pleading for her. The simple, selfless act of courage from this small, terrified child was a force more powerful than Adam's own pain. He looked at the boy, at his fierce loyalty, his unwavering trust, and the ice around Adam's heart didn't just crack, it shattered. He lowered the axe and knelt, pulling the boy into a rough, clumsy embrace. He had been so consumed by the betrayal that he had forgotten the truth standing right in front of him. This child was innocent. This woman had risked everything to save him. When he returned to the cabin, Amelia and Leo were standing by the door, their small bundle on the floor beside them. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Her face was a mask of defeated resignation. He walked past them to the table where the vial still sat beside the peacock feather. He picked it up, pulled the cork with his teeth, and sniffed. A faint, cloying sweetness, overlaid with an earthy, bitter scent. A memory, sharp and sudden, pierced through the fog of time. A field hospital outside Vicksburg. A Confederate colonel, dying on a cot, not from his wounds, but from something else. The field surgeon, an old, weary man, had held up a similar vial. Atropa belladonna, the surgeon had murmured. Deadly nightshade, the assassin's friend, tasteless in wine, looks like a fever. A sophisticated evil. Adam set the vial down. He finally understood. Sterling wasn't just a cruel guardian. He was a methodical, patient monster. This wasn't about a lie. This was about standing against a darkness so absolute it threatened to swallow them all. His choice was made. He went to the corner where he kept his tools, took a hammer and a handful of nails, and retrieved several heavy planks from the porch. He walked back to the door where Amelia and Leo still stood, ready to leave. He didn't look at them. He didn't speak. He simply moved past them to the nearest window and began to hammer the first board into place across the lower pane. The sound was loud and violent in the quiet cabin. A sound of finality. A sound of fortification. Amelia stared at him, her face a canvas of confusion and dawning hope. After he had secured the first window, he turned, his face grim, his eyes clear and resolute. The emptiness was gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a soldier preparing for battle. "He'll come at dusk," Adam said. "Be ready." The hours leading up to dusk were a silent, purposeful ballet of preparation. Adam moved with the grim efficiency of a man who had faced death before. He issued commands, not with the anger of the morning, but with the clipped, focused authority of a field commander. "Amelia, take the blankets from my bed. Hang them over the windows. It will stop the glass from spraying when he shoots. Leo, the water buckets. Fill every one of them from the barrel outside and bring them in. Line them up along the far wall." His own preparations were more lethal. He laid out the Winchester, his Colt revolver, and a box of cartridges on the table, checking each piece with practiced care. He took a heavy wood-boring auger and drilled small, fist-sized holes into the log walls at varying heights. Murder holes, they called them in the war. Firing ports that would allow them to cover the approaches to the cabin without exposing themselves at the windows. Amelia worked without question, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her hands steady. She was no longer just a governess. She was part of this defense. She followed his instructions, her mind sharp and clear now that the agonizing weight of her secret was gone. As she filled a small bag with bandages and a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The waiting was over. The running was done. Here, in this isolated cabin with this grim, resolute stranger, they would make their stand. As the sun began its descent, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of orange and blood red, a new scent drifted on the evening air, the acrid smell of smoke. "He started," Adam said, peering through one of the newly drilled holes. Just as I thought he would, Amelia joined him, her eye pressed to another opening. In the distance, upwind from the barn, a line of fire was crawling through the dry winter grass, the flames licking hungrily at the edges of the snow. The smoke, thick and oily, billowed toward the homestead, a creeping scream that would obscure the tracker's approach. "He wants to draw me out to the barn," Adam said, his voice a low growl. "Thinks I'll run to save my livestock. He underestimates me." He glanced at Leo, who was huddled by the hearth, his small face pale. "Leo, in the root cellar. Now, take a blanket and the lantern, and do not come out, no matter what you hear." "Do you understand?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide with fear but also a fierce trust in the man who was now his protector. Amelia hugged him tightly, kissing his forehead. "Be brave, my love. We'll come for you when it's over." As the boy disappeared through the trapdoor in the floor, Adam turned to her. "Stay away from the front of the cabin. He'll expect us to be watching the fire. He'll come from the side, using the smoke for cover." The waiting was the hardest part. The minutes stretched, each one a lifetime. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the distant, hungry roar of the approaching grass fire. The smoke grew thicker, filling the air with a hazy, suffocating gloom that stung the eyes and throat. Then, a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the woods to the west. It was Vance, moving in a low crouch, a long rifle in his hands, using the pall of smoke as a perfect screen. He wasn't heading for the front door, but for the back, toward the small, unboarded window of the root cellar. Adam's breath hissed through his teeth. It wasn't a diversion to get him out, it was a pincer. The fire to hold their attention at the front, while Vance came for the boy. "He's going for the cellar," Adam whispered, his voice deadly calm. He moved silently to the back of the cabin, positioning himself at a firing port that covered the cellar entrance. "When I fire, get to the door. Bar it with the heavy chest." Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a deep breath, her hand finding the heavy iron poker from the hearth. It wasn't a gun, but it was solid, and it was hers to wield. She nodded. They waited, every nerve screaming, as Vance crept closer. He moved with a liquid grace, a predator in his element. He reached the cellar window, laying his rifle aside as he pulled a knife to pry at the wooden frame. Adam fired. The explosion of the Winchester in the confined space was deafening. The bullet splintered the window frame inches from Vance's head, showering him with wood and dirt. He dropped to the ground, rolling and coming up with his own rifle, firing a blind shot toward the cabin that thudded harmlessly into the log. "Now!" Adam yelled. Amelia flew to the back door, dragging the heavy oak chest in front of it just as Vance's body slammed against the wood from the outside. The bar held. He swore, a vicious, frustrated sound. Then there was silence. "He'll go for the barn," Adam predicted, moving swiftly to a different firing port. "Try to get a better angle." The cat-and-mouse game began in earnest. For the next hour, they exchanged sporadic gunfire. Vance was a patient, skilled hunter, using every bit of cover, never showing himself for more than a second. But Adam was his equal, a soldier who knew the grim geometry of a firefight. He anticipated, he countered, he held his ground. The grass fire had reached the edge of the yard, the heat and smoke becoming a real and present danger. The barn, built of dry, seasoned timber, was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. "I have to get to the horses," Adam said, his face grim in the flickering, hellish light. "If the barn goes, we're trapped here." "It's too dangerous," Amelia protested. "More dangerous to stay. Cover me." Before she could argue, he was moving. He unbarred the front door and slipped out into the smoke-filled twilight, running in a low crouch toward the relative safety of the woodpile. A shot rang out from the woods, kicking up snow where he had been a second before. Amelia's mind worked with a desperate clarity. She had to create a diversion, draw Vance's fire, give Adam the seconds he needed. She ran to the front window, tore the blanket aside, and shoved the barrel of Adam's revolver through the broken pane, firing twice into the darkness where she'd seen the muzzle flash. It worked. Another shot came in her direction, splintering the window frame above her head. She ducked down, heart pounding, praying it had been enough. Inside the barn, Adam worked frantically, his hands finding the familiar harnesses in the smoky darkness. He soothed the terrified horses, his voice a low, calming murmur as he led them from their stalls. He was just about to lead them out the back when the main doors of the barn creaked open. Vance stood silhouetted against the raging fire, a demonic figure with a pistol in his hand. "Looking for these?" he asked, his voice a mocking drawl. He had anticipated Adam's move. Adam shoved the horses back into their stalls and reached for the pitchfork leaning against the wall. "The boy is not your property, Vance. Sterling pays well for the return of what's his," the tracker sneered, stepping into the barn. "And he pays even better for silence." The fight was brutal and primal. The enclosed space of the barn filled with the sounds of desperate struggle, the crack of bone, grunts of pain, the terrified screams of the horses. Adam was stronger, but Vance was faster, a wiry, venomous snake of a man. The pitchfork was clumsy in close quarters, and Vance easily sidestepped it, his knife flashing in the firelight. It slashed across Adam's arm, drawing a sharp cry of pain. Adam dropped the pitchfork, staggering back. Vance lunged, aiming for the kill. At that moment, the loft door above them crashed open. "Get away from him!" Amelia screamed. She had seen the struggle through a gap in the barn siding, had climbed the outer ladder to the hayloft, her mind racing. She hadn't hesitated. She hoisted a heavy bale of hay to the edge and shoved. It landed with a sickening thud, not on Vance, but just behind him, making him stumble. It was the opening Adam needed. He drove his shoulder into the tracker's midsection, sending them both crashing into a stack of empty crates. The pistol flew from Vance's hand, skittering into the shadows. They rolled on the dusty floor, trading blows, two men locked in a life-or-death struggle. Vance's knife flashed again, and Adam cried out, clutching his side. But as Vance raised the knife for a final, fatal blow, Adam's hand found something on the floor. A heavy blacksmith's hammer. He swung it with the last of his strength. The hammer connected with Vance's temple with a dull, wet crunch. The tracker went limp, collapsing on top of him. Adam shoved the man's body off, gasping for breath, pain searing his arm inside. He looked up to see Amelia scrambling down the ladder, her face a mask of terror and relief. "Adam," she breathed, rushing to his side. "You're hurt." "He's alive," Adam grunted, checking Vance's pulse. "Unconscious." Together, they dragged the tracker's dead weight to the root cellar, binding his hands and feet with rope. As Amelia tended to Adam's wounds, her touch gentle and sure, he looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time not as a liability or a mystery, but as a partner, a fighter, a woman of astonishing courage. They had won, for now. As they barred the cellar door, Vance began to stir, a low groan rising from the darkness. He was beaten, but he wasn't broken. "You think you've won?" he rasped, his voice a venomous hiss from the cellar. He coughed, spitting blood onto the dirt floor. "Sterling has a dozen men like me. He owns judges and marshals all the way to Washington. You'll never be safe. He'll never stop hunting his property." His cold, hateful gaze found Amelia. "And that includes the boy." Vance's words hung in the air of the smoke-filled barn, a poison that tainted their hard-won victory. They hadn't just defeated a man. They had declared war on a faceless, untouchable power. Amelia finished tying the bandage around Adam's side, her hands moving with a nurse's steady precision. But her mind was reeling. They could never be safe here. Sterling's reach was too long, his resources limitless. They would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next hunter to appear on the ridge. Adam looked from the barred cellar door to the smoldering remains of the grass fire, now dying in the damp night air. He saw the future Vance had laid out for them, a life of fear, of constant vigilance, of raising a boy who could never truly be free. And in that moment, something shifted within him. The soldier, the survivor who had sought only to hide from the world, was supplanted by the man who had something to protect. "No," he said, his voice low and resolute. "We don't run anymore. We don't hide. We take the fight to him." Amelia stared at him, seeing the new, hard certainty in his eyes. "How?" "Vance is right. Sterling is untouchable." "No man is untouchable," Adam countered, a grim light dawning in his eyes. "He's built his power on the belief that men like him are above the law. We're going to show him he's wrong." He winced as he pushed himself to his feet, leaning on her for support. "First thing in the morning, we ride for redemption. We're taking Vance, we're taking the poison, and we're taking Leo. We're going to find the law, and we're going to make it listen." The journey to redemption was a strange, silent procession. Adam rode one of the horses, his side tightly bound, his face pale but determined. Amelia drove the wagon, Leo beside her, his small hand holding hers with a quiet, trusting strength. Behind them, bound and gagged in the wagon bed, lay Elias Vance, his cold eyes promising retribution. They bypassed the town itself, heading directly for the small, isolated office of the federal marshal, a man named Silas Croft, whom Adam knew by reputation as a straight-backed career lawman, immune to the local politics that often corrupted frontier justice. Marshal Croft was a man weathered by the land he served, his face a roadmap of long years in the sun and wind. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression unreadable. He examined the vial of poison, sniffed its contents, and his eyes narrowed with a flicker of recognition. He listened to Leo, who, with a courage that made Amelia's heart ache, recounted the story of the bad tea and the nights he'd spent with a burning stomach. Finally, Croft walked to the wagon and stared down at the bound tracker. He pulled the gag from Vance's mouth. "Is what they say true?" the marshal asked. Vance met his gaze with a defiant sneer. "You can't prove a thing. Sterling will have my bail posted by noon tomorrow, and he'll have your badge by the end of the week." The marshal's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He turned back to Adam and Amelia. "Sterling's influence reaches the territorial capital. Vance is right. Local courts won't touch him." Amelia's hope, which had been a fragile flame, began to gutter. "So there's nothing to be done?" "I didn't say that," Croft corrected, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. "I said local courts won't touch him. But poisoning a child for his inheritance, hiring a man to cross state lines to hunt down a witness, that's a federal matter." He looked at Adam. "I'm sending a telegraph to the Attorney General's office in Washington. It will take time, but the wheels will turn. Vance here," he gestured to the tracker, "will be my guest in a federal cell until they do. His testimony will be very valuable." The weeks that followed were a time of uncertain waiting. They returned to the homestead, the threat temporarily lifted but the future still unwritten. They worked to repair the damage from the fire and the fight, their shared labor a balm for the trauma they had endured. The silence between them was no longer one of suspicion or distance, but of a deep, shared understanding. They were a unit now, forged in fire and bound by a common purpose. Finally, in late spring, as the first wild roses began to bloom along the fence line, Marshal Croft rode out to the homestead himself. He carried a packet of official-looking documents. "It's done," he announced, accepting the cup of coffee Amelia offered. "Sterling has been indicted by a federal grand jury. His assets are frozen. His political friends have scattered like quail. He'll never threaten you or the boy again." He handed Amelia a document. "And this grants you and Adam Black full legal guardianship of Leo Vance. His inheritance will be held in a federal trust until he comes of age." The news, so long awaited, was almost too much to comprehend. Freedom, true and absolute. Leo, who had been listening from the porch, let out a whoop of pure joy and raced out into the field, his laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Adam, who was watching her with an expression of profound tenderness. The marshal, sensing he was intruding on a private moment, cleared his throat. "I'll be on my way. Justice has been served." After he had gone, Adam and Amelia stood on the porch, watching Leo chase butterflies in the meadow. The homestead, once a desolate refuge, was now a place of life, of hope. The wild roses Amelia had planted along the fence were a riot of defiant color. "You're safe now, Amelia," Adam said softly. "You and the boy, you're free to go wherever you want." She turned to him, a small, sad smile on her face. "Is that what you want, Adam?" "For us to go." He took her hands in his calloused thumbs gently stroking her skin. "What I want," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "is for you to stay. For us to build a life here, together. To be a family." He looked out at the boy, then back at her, his winter sky eyes filled with a warmth she had never thought to see. "This place was just a shelter. You and Leo, you've made it a home." Amelia's heart, so long guarded and afraid, opened like a flower to the sun. "We are home," she whispered, her voice catching. He drew her closer, and his kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of quiet certainty, a promise of shared sunrises and peaceful nights, of a love that had grown in the harshest of soils and blossomed, impossibly, into something beautiful and strong. Later that afternoon, he was teaching Leo how to saddle the gentler of the two horses. Amelia came out onto the porch, her face filled with a peace that seemed to radiate from within. She watched them for a moment, the man and the boy, their heads bent together in easy companionship, and she knew she was witnessing the start of a story, not the end of one. Adam looked up and saw her, and his smile was a thing of pure, unguarded joy. He walked over to her, taking her hand. He looked at the blooming roses, at Leo, at the vast, open land that stretched before them, no longer a place to hide, but a place to grow. "I was thinking," he said, "that fence line could use some more roses." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full. "I think so, too." They had forged a family from courage and sacrifice, a home built not on blood, but on a love that was as wild, resilient, and beautiful as the roses that now grew in the dust. They were finally safe, finally free, and finally, irrevocably, home.